I think what they get in my class that they're not getting elsewhere, which I find a little sad, to absolutely, positively, unconditionally question everything that they believe. Question it all, and it's okay. And if you disagree with all of science, that's okay. That doesn't make you anti-science. It doesn't. It makes you actually probably a better scientist because you're questioning what you know, and our mental models restrict what we can do. And our mental models are incredibly useful, right? They allow us to function in a complex world, but they also limit our ability to see beyond. And we're incredibly restricted by our what how we see the world, what we see and what we believe. When I look out my window, what I believe that is, it restrains how I perceive the world. And so it's hard for me to see anything else. Uh, one of the we read in there, we've read a lot of books in there, but we read in there a book by Thomas Kuhn. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He's a philosopher of science,
Yes, of
and
course.
he's wrote this famous book that most scientists believe in, but there's still people who don't believe in what he wrote. Paradigms. Well, that's what I call it. Everyone calls it paradigms. It's called
Structure of Scientific
thank you.
Revolutions.
It's a great book. It's quite short. Um, but one of the things he talks about is the discovery of X-rays, which were discovered by this guy named Rankin. He's famous in the radiology world, who discovered X-rays, and they were physically impossible at his time. Like, it was impossible for them to exist. And he discovered them, figured out they do exist, and people, it turns out, had already observed them before him. Several of his contemporaries had observed them without a doubt. But their mental model was, these are impossible. So what I'm observing is not real. I have messed something up. I've messed something up. And so what I think I saw, I didn't. My experiment was screwed up. And I actually got this aberrant outcome that's not real, because their mental models wouldn't allow them to see him. And I think that's what the students take away from my class is they're allowed to question their mental models in neuroscience mostly, but in everything that we mostly, they're all neuroscientists. So
That's not a small thing, is to realize that your measurements are constructs uh, that may be entirely detached from reality. They may be in the way of your ability to see reality. Um, they may be
yes,
distractions. They may be mere projections. Um, that that may be the most important thing for us to say about this whole work of measurement. And we're not looking for metrics to prove to somebody something. We're actually looking for something deeper than that. And if it takes us 5 years to figure out a some practice of noticing that would be grounded in complexity and also grounded in the notion that the systems that we're regarding as complex have qualities of life to them. They're not just, I'm talking to a scientist of complexity. They're not just complex. Well, complex is way beyond the mechanical complicatedness that I think lay people think of it as. But the language of life helps us actually keep the extraordinary mystery of complexity even more vital. So that's sort of what's driving some of this. And so we don't need to. None of us have answers to this, but I'm interested in sort of where your brain might go.
I think humans are obsessed with measurement to our great fault. That, and I wrote down what in the almost first sentence Gary spoke. He said quality, and I want to know what you all think about the difference between quality and quantity, because quantities are measurable. Qualities are technically not measurable. That's essentially the definition of them. But humans are obsessed with quantifying quality, because to measure means to quantify. A quality is something that I believe, and some other complex systems people believe, is inherently human, and humans are amazing at identifying quality, but not quantifying it. We're not obsessed, or at least I haven't seen anybody, maybe people are, obsessed with measuring love. How do you measure love? Well, it has a quality, not necessarily a quantity. Some people say, "Oh, do you love me more?" Yeah, fine. But what they really mean is how deep is that love, and how rich is it, and how meaningful is it? But we haven't come up with measures for it, although people probably will on the smartphone. The more you swipe right, the more you love, or something. But we really are obsessed with quantifying quality. And that's my pessimistic thing, because I wish we had quit being obsessed with it. But we are obsessed with it, and everyone wants it. So I think we're stuck with it. I'm not a social scientist. I know very little about the stuff you all talk about. But I am an academician. I'm in the academy, if you will. And the academy is obsessed, like all other humans and all other efforts, with quantifying the quality of an academician. They want to quantify how good I am at being a scholar. And when you quantify something that you really care about the quality, you have to make a metric, right? Or some measurable value. And when you do that, what you end up doing is changing the goal of the system, because the system will function to optimize this new value, this new variable that you want to measure. So by measuring it, it's almost quantum in a sense. By measuring the system, you're actually changing the system, and you're changing it to function towards whatever measurement you're trying to optimize. So if you want to optimize profit, that's what the system's going to try and do. And the system being a bunch of humans. So in academia, if you want to find a good mentor, right? Ask who's the good mentor. People know who the good mentor is. It's not a secret. Or who's the oh, if you want to take a class in complex sciences, who's the best professor to take it from? And they won't say me. No, I'm just kidding. They'll tell you. And then you say, well, how did you quantify it? They didn't quantify it. Humans are great at knowing quality. And as soon as you say, well, that doesn't work, we have to quantify it, then you say, okay, how do you quantify it? Well, we count the number of papers you publish, and we count the number of grants you get at the more undergraduate type campuses. It has more to do with publications still. It's not about excellence. Change the name, because it changes the target. The target for research excellence is no longer research excellence. The system isn't striving to optimize excellence. Excellence is generation of new, important knowledge. That's what a scholar does, not cover their salary. But it brings up a couple of points I will touch on. Measurement is important, because people won't fund stuff if it's not measurable, right? I realize that. But you have to be careful what you measure, because it can change the system's goals. Complex systems have delays in them, and the delays can be substantial. And when you're trying to measure something, you better be aware of any delays and account for those delays. Because when you start measuring immediacy, you're measuring the wrong things. But yet we all go about and do similar things in everything we measure, because we want to know immediately if it's working. In system science, systems have stocks and flows, and the stock is the pool of stuff, and the flow is it moving around. And you can change flows really, really quickly. Flows can be changed almost immediately, but stocks have delay in them. And it's like a bathtub full of water is their analogy. And so when you want to change something in a stock, you have to be careful that just changing the flow can have effects that you don't expect. It's called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. I really like this book. I find it's very practical and honest, and puts out some things out there that people don't like to talk about. Like, she often speaks of stop trying to measure qualities, because essentially by definition they're not measurable. Quantities are measurable, and you can quantify a quality, but then you're not measuring the quality itself. You're measuring however you define that quantity. Another book, and this is the book that we're doing in my class right now. It's much more academic and much thicker. But it's actually a really good book, because the thing I like about this book is it puts things much more concrete and practical. Like, here's how to do this in a complex system. Here's how to assess this. Here's how to assess that. Donella Meadows' book's more theoretical and about measuring and why you should measure and how you should measure. And this book's much more concrete. So those sort of my things. I would tell you, if I knew how to measure complex systems, then I would be the world's greatest neuroscientist, but I don't know how to measure them. And I struggle with it every day. And what I do in realizing every time I try to measure something, I end up forcing it into a reductionist viewpoint to try and make it work sort of within my mental model. Because and most neuroscientists do. For example, brain networks have become all the rage. I mean, brain networks are like dominating human neuroscience now, whereas 10 years ago they were on the fringe. Now if you're not doing brain networks, you're not doing neuroscience. But they're just replicating everything we've done with older methods. So it's not like anyone's doing anything new, because we have a hard time figuring out what that should be. There is one thing, and this is fairly brain specific, but it might tweak some thoughts from y'all. One thing I've been thinking about in neuroscience is to try and get at complexity in systems. It relates to what I just said about networks. We're still in brain networks, trying to find where in the brain the hub is, or where in the brain, some part of the network is. And what that ends up doing is putting the focus back on the element instead of the interactions. And in a system, the elements, while they have to exist, it's the interactions that are essential. That's the whole premise. So an example often given is, if you have a basketball team, you can change out the players. You still have a basketball team, still striving to do the same thing. They may be a little better or a little worse, but they're striving to do the same thing. But if you change the rules, it's no longer basketball. It's now some other game. And the rules are essentially the interconnections that govern the system. In the brain, we're still focused on trying to find where things are. And I don't know if I've mentioned this is the idea that the brain's more like a hologram. And in a hologram, every point of the holographic image, when it's on the film, not when you're looking at the hologram, the actual piece of film. And when you take a holographic image, you shoot lasers at this object you want to image. And one of them is direct, and one of them is to the film, and one of them is bouncing off your object. And what happens is you get wave interference, literally like quantum wave interference stuff. And so then when you look at the film, every single point on that film actually contributes to the whole image when you actually make the holographic image, which comes about by shooting the laser, reversing the laser back through the film, and the holographic image appears. So instead of like a traditional image where each point represents the point on the film, in a holographic film, each point contributes to every point of the image.
Paul, just so you know the mental model, I'm hearing your description of the brain. I'm a beekeeper now. I
Okay.
actually got a 92 on my North Carolina bee certification exam. I will have you know.
Excellent.
Whoa, whoa.
That's excellent.
I'm prouder of
Wow.
that than my doctorate.
I bet.
Wow.
But as you may know, bees are a fundamental expression of a complex phenomenon. And
Yes.
you can never ask which bee thought that, which bee decided this. Not even the queen, especially not the queen. A hive is a brain.
That's perfect. That's another perfect analogy. So with the hive, so one of the things that's really interesting about that, and I'm not a beekeeper, so if I overstep my analogy, when you have a system like that, there's two properties that are really important. One is the information is distributed across the whole, right? So no one point in there has
Right.
that contains the essence of the information. But the other thing is you can knock out a bunch of it and you still retain the information. In the brain, my thought is, look, everyone's looking for where in the brain something's happening. And we've been doing it for centuries. And now we're just looking for it with networks instead of our old technology. But the reality is every point in the brain contributes to every single experience. Every point contributes, absolutely contributes. Now, it may not be the essence of the experience, but it contributes. So if you want to study for your beekeeping test and you get up in the morning and you're in a kind of pissy mood, is your studying going to be as effective as if you woke up in the morning and you're in a great mood, ready to go tackle the world? No, you're going to do much better when you wake up ready to tackle the world. Well, guess what? That doesn't localize, that mood doesn't localize to where you need to store the information for your beekeeping test. Those are two different parts of the brain, but they absolutely, positively are inextricably linked. And one part of the brain affects the other all the time. It may be bigger, it may have a larger or smaller effect, but it's all a whole. And so if we can start studying things as a whole rather than breaking them apart, we might have a chance. I'm going to show you real quick, if you don't mind.
Good.
I'll show you a couple of pictures of the hologram. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is how you make a hologram. You basically split a laser and you send it through two different ways to get to the object. And one goes directly to the film, the other goes through the object. But the point being that once you do this, every point on this recording media contributes to every point on the ultimate object. And it's based on the frequency domain. So your central part of this film has the lower frequency information that captures form and shape, and the periphery has the high frequency stuff that adds detail and or noise. And so actually, this is the equivalent of a hologram in two-dimensional space. It's a 2D Fourier transform of an image. It's what we, in MRI world, this is how MRI images are collected. They're collected in the space, it's called K-space. If you take a 2D Fourier transform of this image, you get that. So that's me as a quote hologram. But what I was mentioning that's so fascinating, I don't remember what's in these slides, so I hope they're not. Oh yeah, so there's actually a central and a peripheral. So if you just look at the central part of the space, you'll get the form. If you look at the peripheral, you'll get the details. So this is the central part. This is the peripheral part. So you can actually throw, I think I may have done this. That's them summed together. You can actually throw away half of the information and still reconstruct my image. It's not artifact free, but it's still there. Unlike in our two-dimensional or three-dimensional world, two-dimensional when we're looking at photos, when we think of a photo, if you cut out half of it, we think of it as gone. But in a distributed system, that's not the case. And so that's sort of the point I wanted to show you, that you not only does every point contribute to every point in this 2D, in the actual photo, but you can throw away tons of information and still recapture the truth. And so in the brain, one of the reasons I think that rehabilitation works is because the system can perform in the absence of specific regions, even if we sort of say, oh, those regions are necessary. At some point, when you damage the system enough, it's not going to work. But that's one of the things I've been thinking about, and how we can measure that and how we can assess the whole instead of the parts. Let's not get hooked up on these 5 things existing independently, because they don't. They themselves are inextricably linked, and they're actually sort of the whole, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot also is boundaries. The boundaries between them are whatever we draw. And we draw those boundaries for good reason, because we need something to talk about and comprehend. But those boundaries are typically human made. And so we draw them for practical reasons. And we just have to remember that they're there for practical reasons, and they're not there in reality, probably. And so these things are meshing into one another. How do you measure all that at once and come up with an assessment of that without breaking them apart? That's what's so hard.
Yep. So Paul, I wonder whether we ought to just totally get rid of the measurement word entirely, because everything you've said teaches me the word makes us dumber, not smarter. And but I wonder if there is a discipline of noticing that we might be disciples of noticing. In other words, we're literally followers after a way of systematically noticing phenomena. And that's what I mean by measurement. Well, but nobody else hears measurement and means that. You know, who both TC and I, we literally turn to each other and say, you're describing the brain of Larry Prey, who spending just a few hours with you. And by that time, he had already had huge damage to his neural system. And yet he was able to recognize who you really were and bring it to word with an image and poetry, in a way that's magically complex. In your series of images, I recognized Paul as soon as I saw just the peripheral knowledge. I realized, oh, Paul, and it triggered a lot of what I know about you. And so there's something about the relationality of an image that isn't just as complex as a hologram. It's as complex as the relationship between the one who the hologram was taken and the technology of the hologram and the one who's observing it. And so there's all of that relationality going on all in the precise moment. And as you say, humans are really great at doing all that instantly. We don't even have to know what's going on to say, oh, that's Paul.
Right, I agree. And computers are notoriously horrible at this.
Yeah.
So the quantitative machines we have are absolutely horrible at it. I mean, I don't know if you remember about 5 years ago when Google announced that their machine learning was able to see a cat on the web. It's like all of Google, and that was what you could do. And the picture that it saw was like, yeah, okay, that's a cat. I'll give you that. Yeah, you had a 3-year-old kitty, right? I mean, immediately. We are really good at seeing qualities of things. One of the challenges I think that LCL has is convincing people that that's enough. that seeing the quality is enough. And I don't know how you convince people of that. That if we somehow look past our mental models and start to think, okay,
Yeah.
if quantifying things, there's nothing wrong with quantifying things. Don't get me wrong. If there's something to be measured, let's measure it. But if we want to measure something that doesn't lend itself to measurement like we think about it, maybe we need a new word that isn't measurement, because that word's loaded. Immediately, they're going to want to know what's our precision, right? So a different word that allows us to assess a system's function in a meaningful way, that accounts for all the systemness, that accounts for delays, that accounts for interconnectivity, and that hopefully doesn't change the goal of the system. Because I really think measurement changes the goals of the system in horrible, horrible ways that no one's willing to accept. Because I live in the century of quantitative process thinking that that's what's valued. And it's really hard to convince someone that there might be something really important that's not quantitative, that computers don't do well, that humans do really well. No, we can teach the computer to do it better. And I think humans do some things really well. And we just attribute it to bias. And if it's human and a computer can't do it, it's human bias. Well, sometimes human bias might mean knowledge. We're pretty smart beings, I think. I recognize in our world, there's short-term demands that are vital for existence. If you don't meet short-term demands, you don't exist. And so I end up in my real life spending most of my time doing short-term demands and not trying to solve this problem. We do have to measure stuff. And so if we're going to measure qualities, I think it's just important that we're really, really careful about what we measure, and what we call what we measure, because it can change the system behavior. And then you're not measuring the same system you had, you're measuring a new system. And I'll just briefly come back to my example. Research excellence has nothing to do with how much my salary is covered. So, but if you call it that, you will change people's behavior.